Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
Alors, merci et bienvenue à l'épisode 170. Thank you and welcome to episode 170. If you haven't listened to episode 169, go back and listen to it. Endiament was very interesting. We talked about menopause. We talked about ADD and the late diagnosing of that and how to work on trauma, among many other things. So please go back and listen to it. But episode 170 will be with Sarah Wayte. Sarah Wayte, I love, what the first thing she told me is that I'm an accidental paramedic. And she no longer practices, but she talked about her experience with that. So, if I want to give you a brief discussion, following a 20-year career in the UK as a paramedic, Sarah up with her husband and 2 cats and moved to Canada. She's out on the West Coast. I'm sure she'll talk about that. She's now a creative copywriter and brand photographer. She's a co-host of a podcast about creativity and writes and takes photographs in her spare time. She was late diagnosed with ADHD too, so that's why I was mentioning that about the last interview, and now fully embraces her neurospicy life. She also enjoys writing and talking about her experiences as a paramedic, especially through the lens of mental health and how it impacts the first responders. She is someone I was looking very much forward to talking, so here's the interview. GetFree.ai. Yes, you've heard me talk about it previously in other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because GetFree.ai is just a great service. Imagine being able to pay attention to your clients all the time instead of writing notes and making sure that the note's going to sound good and how are you going to write that note and things like that. GetFree.ai liberates you from making sure that you're writing what the client is saying, because it is keeping track of what you're saying and will create after the end of every session a progress note. But it goes above and beyond that. Not only does it create a progress note, it also gives you suggestions for goals, gives you even a mental status if you've asked questions around that, as well as being able to write a letter for your client to know what you talked about. So that's the great thing. It saves me time, it saves me a lot of aggravation, and it just speeds up the progress note process so well. And for $99 a month, I know that that's nothing. That's worth my time. That's worth my money. The best part of it too is that if you want to go and put in the code Steve50 when you get the service, at the checkout code is Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. And if you get a whole year, you save a whole 10% for the whole year. So again, Steve50 at checkout for GetFree.ai will give you $50 off for the first month, and like I said, get a full year, get 10% off, get freed from writing notes, get freed from always scribbling while you're talking to a client, and just paying attention to your client so they win out, you win out, everybody wins. And I think that this is the greatest thing. And if you're up to a point where you got to change the treatment plan, well, the goals are generated for you. So GetFree.ai, code Steve50 to save $50 on your first month. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 170. I'm so happy to have Sarah Wayte with me today. I dubbed her the accidental paramedic based on our little conversation that we had through email and Facebook. But Sarah, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm always fascinated because, being a Canadian myself, born and raised, and people going to Canada, but I don't want to jump to that right away. I know that you moved from the UK to Canada, but I want to bring that question up a little later on. Maybe I feel like I'm getting to know you still, but my audience has no clue who you are. So how about you tell a little bit about my audience about yourself?
Oh my goodness, where do I even begin? I am Sarah, and currently now residing in BC, Canada, but I am originally from the UK. I was born in the UK, but I'm also half Maltese, which is a tiny little island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea called Malta. So my background is it's such a big, long story. But I became a paramedic by accident 2008, but I've got a 20-year history in the ambulance service in the UK, which again was an accident. I left home. I was living in Malta at the age of 19, hated living there, moved back to the UK, and I needed work because I was determined not to go back to Malta. And I saw an ad in the paper for it was like the equivalent of like 911 call handler. Basically, it was the taking the emergency calls, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I can do that until I figure out what I want to do, what I want to be when I grow up. And that led to a 20-year career in the ambulance service, which I very nearly couldn't get myself out of until I moved to Canada. That's what kind of got me out of the ambulance service in the end. So that's a really quick rundown, but hopefully that gives you some idea.
Well, it gives us plenty of places to go, that's for sure. I always thought that paramedics went to accidents. They don't become accidental paramedics, but hey, what do I know? One of the standard questions from finding your way through therapy is exactly that. We ask people, have they ever been in therapy? So I'm going to ask you that question. Have you ever been in therapy?
I have several times, actually. Going way back, I was first introduced to therapy when I was a teenager. Actually, I got bullied in school, so I got sent to a school counselor at that point, but it was classed as therapy. And it's weird. I had forgotten all about that until my most recent therapy that I've just finished about a year with a therapist in the last year. So yeah, I've had a few instances.
How was your experience in therapy? Has it been mostly good, mostly inquisitive, mostly thought-provoking, something else?
No, really good, actually. This most recent experience, I actually found what was the word she used? Like my what's the word? My balance, like my center, basically. I had this like very incredible experience that I was telling everybody about afterwards because I've never been there before. And actually it was really interesting because I think a lot of it was talking about earlier stuff back from way before I became a paramedic. But I think being a paramedic exacerbated a lot of the ways I was feeling. So there was a lot of stuff to get through. But yeah, I reached a point of being like completely almost like Zen. It was great. I was fantastic.
And now it's all gone. That's what you're saying?
No, I'm good. I am happier than I have been in a very long time. So yes.
Well, I think that's what makes it very interesting because we talk about the journey being exactly what you said. We don't know what the journey is going to lead us. How do we get into this thought process? I think you were sharing pre-interview that your husband is a paramedic and wanted to be a paramedic since age 4. I'm like, yeah. I mean, what an oddball. But maybe we can talk about your journey since it sounds very judgmental for someone I've never met to say that to. But hey, I want to break stereotypes about Canadians being polite. So that's part of my other goal. Let's talk about your journey a little bit. So you're looking for a job. You fall into this ass backwards, basically. So you got to be motivated to stay other than hunger. Because, there's got to be things that you enjoyed about the job or maybe you didn't. But so maybe we can start there and go from there. So maybe a little bit about what, you go in like bright eye and bushy tail and that dies off, but in a month or two, usually for most people.
Yeah.
But I don't want to write your story. I want you to paint that story.
Thanks, I will. So, I mean, obviously, I started in the control room, first of all, taking calls, and then it progressed very quickly to being a dispatcher. So that's what I did for the first 7 years. I was sending the ambulances all over the county and responding to calls. And it was I was amazed I stayed there as long as I did, actually. I think it was like 7.5 years there. And every day was busy. It was stressful. It was hard work. It was 12-hour shifts with like 5 or 6 screens around you. You had to know where everybody was at any one time. There was obviously this push to make sure you're responding to calls quickly and leaving no patients waiting and all of that kind of stuff. And I think when I first started, I was completely naive. I had no idea that it was what I was kind of getting myself into. But it was, I've asked myself this question many times, what kept me there? And I think it was the rush. I think there was an adrenaline rush to it. There was a real sense of satisfaction of a job well done when you could actually see that you were making differences to people. And a lot of it was the camaraderie as well. The people that I worked with kept me there for a long, long time, actually. It certainly wasn't it was I can say this now because I don't work for them anymore, but it wasn't the bosses, it wasn't the management. There was a lot of company politics within the ambulance service. It certainly wasn't any of that. In fact, a lot of that made me want to leave quite frequently as well. So it felt like there was a real push pull all the time. And also for me as well, I went into the ambulance service with no qualifications. I wasn't qualified for anything. I was 20 years old. I'd not finished school. I hadn't gone to university, so I had no other qualifications. And I felt like I got to a point where I wasn't qualified to do anything else. This was all I knew. So when I decided to become a paramedic, in fact, it wasn't even a decision to become a paramedic. I said, I'm done working in the control room. I might as well apply to become a paramedic and see if they'll take me. And if not, I'll go and work in a store somewhere. That was my thought process. As it turned out, the person who interviewed me to become a paramedic went, "Yeah, we'll take you on." So, that was it. It just kept me there. And that was a new kind of adrenaline. Once I got out onto the road and I was seeing patients, it was stressful, but in a different way. It felt more, at the time, initially, it felt more physical stress because you're out and you're busy and you're lifting patients and, you're doing a lot of more physical stuff. I didn't think about the mental stuff until way later, but it was a different kind of stress from what I'd had in the control room. But I've discovered I did quite well under stressful situations, and I've since learned that's probably an ADHD trait. People with ADHD are very good in emergency situations, so we're pretty well suited to working in places like the ambulance service, frontline kind of work. So yeah, that's that. I think it was an accidental finding that this was my place. And it was very much every now and again a call would happen and you would save a life and you would feel like you were on top of a mountain and you just wanted to keep chasing that feeling, basically. So I think that's what kept me there for a long, long time.
Well, a lot of people keeps the adrenaline rush really feels good. And,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I'm in a group for first responders in the area, and I talk about the God complex. And,
Yes.
that's part of what it is. So I
Yeah.
definitely get what you just said. And one of the things that I want to mention too, because you talk about being in the control room, as we call it in US and Canada, we call it more like dispatch.
Dispatch. Yes.
And dispatchers are highly, highly underappreciated for the stress they go through.
It's very true.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you have any comments on that, but I certainly, and guilty as charged. Sometimes I'll mention all my first responders. In dispatch. It's always like an afterthought, and that's on me too.
Mm.
But can you speak more about that, in the control room, the dispatch, and how, there is some value in that, but people don't understand the stress that it also, besides having six screens, as you said, there's other
Mhm.
stressors that go with that people don't really get.
Oh yeah, totally. Do you know it's that they are like the unsung heroes because I kind of equated it to it was even different from the people who took the calls. They were more recognized because it was, the patient or their family would be like, "Oh, that person on the phone was amazing. They gave me advice, helped me save this person's life until you guys got here," kind of thing. So they got recognized, but nobody saw what happened in between the call coming in and then the ambulance arriving, which was the dispatcher. That was it. That wouldn't happen without that person, and that person is completely. I think that was the big stress area came from the fact that they were juggling everything. You'd look at an entire area and you'd maybe have, where I worked, you had maybe 50, anywhere between 50 and 100 ambulances in your
County.
area that you were managing at any one time. You had to know, and we were taught as well. Lovely manager, very old school. He was very much of the belief that if you didn't know where your ambulances were when the power went out, then you weren't a good dispatcher. So you had to know where everything was. He would come and test you, and he'd swing your chair around and go, "Tell me where this crew is. Tell me where that crew is." And you'd be like, "Yes, they're on this call, and they're going here." And so you had to know. Your short-term memory was incredible, basically. I knew where, any one time where my crews were. I also knew the calls that and I called them my crews as well. It was like I was their mother for the shift, basically. So, and I felt responsible for them. If they went to a call that was really horrendous, I wanted to make sure they were okay afterwards. And I took a lot of that on myself. So there's a lot of that stress as well. The responsibility of worrying about your crews, making sure they're safe and, not going through awful things, which some of them invariably were. And just the sheer business of it all, just like literally having calls coming in. It was like playing a big game of chess all the time. You were always moving things around, trying to make sure you could respond to like a cardiac arrest really quickly, diverting crews off of other calls, making really quick decisions. Is this patient more sick than this one? Do I need to be moving this ambulance to this call instead? And it was a 12-hour shift of constant mental gymnastics, basically. I would go home at the end of every day with a massive migraine, sleep for 10 hours and then come back and do it all again. So yeah, they don't get sung about often enough, unfortunately. So
And you're right, and I think that that's why I wanted to talk about it, because one of my biggest pet peeves is even within the system we work here. The dispatch is also kind of like, I'll talk about the Northeast intelligently, but I think it's across the U.S. and even in Canada. That's great, but remember, you're just a civilian. You're not one of us. And
yes.
and I think that exclusionary standpoint happens just about everywhere. And
Oh
just by
yeah.
curiosity, it's not 911 in England. What is it?
It's 999 in England.
Thank you. I forgot
Yeah.
about that. But hey, PSA for anyone in Europe listening. But talk a little more about, because the other part too is I really feel like they're underappreciated. But more importantly, like I shared this before on the podcast, and someone goes to a call with, domestic with violence or whatever, and you're talking to the person while the police is going on the way, and then suddenly you hear bang, or you hear like, ah, or yelling, and then it cuts off. That
Yes.
pressure on the dispatcher, the communication center, is absolutely mind-boggling, and I don't think that's
Oh,
appreciated as much.
oh, so much. Yeah. I probably appreciate this more I obviously did good few years as a paramedic, actually working with patients, going out to patients and stuff. And then I came back into the control room, into the dispatch center, and I worked on telephone triage for a little while, actually. And I had a newfound appreciation for the difficulty of not knowing what was going on or being able to actually do something. I was at the end of a phone, and there would be so many times I would want to reach through the phone to make things right because I knew what to do. And I think, I mean, the call handlers in the UK are not, most of them are not medical. I think sometimes they are, but most of the time they're not medical. They are typically civilians. They come in off the street. They're trained how to take emergency calls and follow a system. But there was still that sense of, oh, I can do something here. If people, especially trying to get people to listen as well, that was when you could give them advice that could help in the meantime. And yeah, situations like that, if you would hear noises like that and phones getting cut off and things, then your mind would just go crazy thinking about all the possible things that were going on, and you had no way of being able to see or do or be there in that moment to help. That distance, I think, made it, like being on the other end of a phone, made that so much more difficult, definitely.
I definitely wanted to shout out the dispatchers that I work with. Underappreciated, and exactly what you just said, and then some. But, and the joke I wanted to make earlier was, people listening, and, I can reach to the phone and help them. And I was going to say, well, is that why so you're like, fuck this shit. I'm going to become a paramedic. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to be able to help. Is that what brought that
Yeah.
transition on, or what brought that transition?
No, do you know that maybe that was a part of it, that it was, no, actually it wasn't. I think for some people it is. We had a lot of dispatchers would go on to be paramedics, and that was because they were tired of being the person on the other end of the phone, and they wanted to just go out and do the job, basically. So I think that was the case for a lot of people. For me, it was very much I'd come to the end of my life as a dispatcher, and it was just like that was the natural transition, was to go out onto the road to be, to work operationally. So it was just a case of, let's see if they'll take me, and if not, I'll go somewhere else instead. So
And when, I think that when you talk about a transition from phone to on site, essentially, that's what I call it, and emergency on site work, because you still did emergency, but it wasn't on site work necessarily. How easily is it to adapt to that, or how hard is it to adapt? And what were the things you faced that you felt were very easy, and the other stuff that you went, oh, fuck?
so the transition was like, for us at the time, it was a 12-week course in a classroom, basically being taught all the very basics of we went out as student paramedics. So they taught us the very bare minimum that we needed to know in 12 weeks, crammed us full of like anatomy and physiology and doing exams and, all the basic stuff, CPR and basic skills and all of that kind of stuff. And then I think you did a couple of weeks driving course as well. So they taught you how to drive with the lights and the sirens, and which was obviously the best part. We all enjoyed that. And then off you went out into the big wide world as a trainee paramedic. You were a student working with someone qualified. And actually that's when the real training began for most of us. All the stuff that they teach you in the classroom is nothing like what you'll see when you're out there. And I had no idea what I was going to be facing. I kind of knew a little bit because I'd been a dispatcher. I knew, and I was friends with a lot of paramedics as well. So I got to know a little bit about some of the things, but until you're there and facing them, you just don't know. I mean, the first time I saw an open fractured lower leg, it was like, oh, that's what bones look like. I was just like, and it was that moment I realized, okay, this is a sink or swim moment. I'm either going to like pass out here or I have to do something. And luckily brain kicked in and was like, we must do something. Let's fix this now, So, but you don't know until you face that, how you're going to deal with that. The first time I went to a hanging, which was really an unfortunate outcome. It was like, they sent a manager to me because I'd never seen one before. And I think I surprised them because I was like, this is going to sound a little bit morbid, but I was like, I've never felt a broken neck before. Can I see what that feels like? It was like a learning experience for me because I was new and excited. And even though it was an awful situation, I was curious to know for learning for future, whether I'd be able to help somebody in the future kind of thing. So I came at it very much from a place of curiosity. I was lucky at this point. I was already with my partner who had been a paramedic for a couple of years. So I had him as a really good resource. I think I learned a lot from him before I'd actually faced it myself. And him being a very enthusiastic paramedic, as we've already talked about, that was definitely really helpful. I have a feeling if it had been the other way around, because I was not an enthusiastic paramedic at all. In fact, I would probably put a lot of people off the job now if they spoke to me. So if it had been the other way around, it might have been a completely different story. But I was fortunate that he was so passionate about the job and what it entailed that I think I just kind of jumped in with both feet and waited to see what happened, really. So yeah.
Well, and I think that when you're dealing with hard scenes, just like you just described, sometimes it is our defense mechanism to say, gee, I never felt a broken neck. Why? That way I don't have to deal with this scene per se. I'm just dealing with a broken neck.
Yeah.
Is that part of the stuff too, Dick? Because where I think is underestimated is that what I hate hearing, and I hear this sometimes from, and I am a civilian. I am not pretending I'm not. I hear civilians talk about it as, well, isn't that what they signed up for? I don't know if gruesome was exactly what they signed up for, or feeling like shit about it or whatever. Mm-hmm. But talk a little bit about that, because I think that for me, It is so difficult to see your first hanging or your first shooting. And, I still remember some of my scenes that I was on for the first time and going, and even today I think about it and like just, I get a little bit of goosebumps just thinking about it. And again, civilian. I showed up as a civilian mental health clinician, not a first responder. So anyone listening to this, I'm not stealing any valor.
Yeah, no, I think you learn really quickly and early on in your career that you learn how to dissociate, which is it's not healthy by any stretch of the imagination, but it's the only way to cope. And it's definitely a coping mechanism. And very early on as well, as a paramedic, it was a different service when I first started, in that it was much quieter. We didn't have as many calls as came later. So you had time to like have discussion with your crewmates and your colleagues in the break room. You'd all hang out together and you discuss calls together, and it was almost like a peer review. Almost, you'd have like a learning experience together, talking about what you did and what you could have done better, and everyone throwing in some of their experience and advice. And it was crew room banter. There would be a lot of laughter and joking about stuff as well, which probably the civilians would be horrified at.
Dark humor and gallows humor makes us survive. But please go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. And then obviously later on, it got so busy you never ever went back to the crew room, so you didn't have that opportunity anymore. So it became very much a case of compartmentalizing it in your brain. You'd see a thing, it was awful. You would put it in a box and you'd push it out of the way, and you think, I will deal with that later, whenever later comes, which for a lot of people it would come very unexpectedly and not very nicely, unfortunately. So yeah, so there was definitely that element to it, but there was something you said and I've completely forgotten now.
I forgot my own stuff, so don't worry. But no, I think that we talk about, dark, gallows humor, we talk about dark humor, we talk about dealing with it and how we don't, you talked about peer review. I call it peer support and
Yeah.
being able to talk about it because that as time goes on, that changes. And then you go to scenes and, it's like next call and you don't necessarily have that time. But,
No, yeah.
and
And
I,
there's also, sorry to interrupt you.
I
There's
know, go
there's that
ahead.
element there's that element of not dealing with it eventually in the end. You just stop. You would just cram it down. I mean, the box would get very, very full basically. And when you try and stuff a box and it starts to burst at the edges, and that's basically what was happening. You just kept cramming things down and down and down. And yeah, at some point it would spill over. And I saw lots of people's personalities, my own included, change over the years as I worked in the service. And yeah, it's just not healthy.
Well, it's the proverbial 10 pounds of shit in a 5 pound bag. I mean, at one point it's
Yes,
just going to explode at the seams. I know that what do they
very
call
messy.
people on Discovery tried to do it, and they clearly could tell that they couldn't do it. Mythbusters actually tried to do it. So, but I really think that once you don't have that peer review, you don't get that peer support.
Yeah.
We need to repress it, but like you said, it shows up in a weird way at other points and
Mm,
times in your life because you can see so much bloodshed, you can see so much difficulties, domestic violence, or all those things before it starts affecting you. I don't, and I just want, I want to acknowledge that because I also think that you bring that home. You said that it changes you, and I do believe that it absolutely changes you. How did you feel it changed you?
I became very depressed and angry and well, I went through a range of emotions. There was a point I'm really well aware of, a point of I hit they call it sympathy fatigue, where I just did not care. I was so apathetic to everything I was going out to, which is not what you want from a paramedic, really, when you're calling them in your most stressful moments. You want someone who's going to actually care for you, right? And then turning up to people at 4 a.m. with their complaints and me going, just get on the ambulance. I don't, I didn't even really want to know at that point. And that was a thing. And yeah, being very angry. There was a lot of one of the things they used to advise us a lot of was I remember the biggest piece of advice I ever got given before I became a paramedic was you have to be as lovely and nice to the last person that you see in a shift as you are to the first person. And that's really hard to do when you are called, as an example, to maybe someone who has cut their finger and something really doesn't
Benign.
really, yeah, something really benign when you've just been out to, say, I don't know, a 16-week-old cardiac arrest or something like that. So trying to keep that same level of professionalism and kindness and is really hard. And yeah, so I think and I am a person who wears her heart on her sleeve as well. I'm not very good at keeping my emotions at bay or my opinions, honestly. There were times when I had crewmates say to me, you need to go outside and wait outside and I'll deal with this, because otherwise I would have probably got myself fired or, yeah. And then, yeah, there was falling down the hole of depression as well for a long time, being very, very depressed, thinking this is not where I want to be. I need to get the hell out of here, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a full range of emotions and feelings, I think.
Does it affect your self esteem? Because I know that for some guys, when I talk to them, this is one of the common things is that, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're finally in your bunk, you've had all calls all day, you finally can relax a little bit. And then you get a phone call and then you hear the ding, you got to go to the call. And it's someone who's like, "Oh yeah, I've had back pain for 2 days, but I decided to call 911 at 3 a.m.
Mm,
For that." And your lack of empathy in that particular moment is really clear because you were sleeping and everything else, and they have to put it in check. And
yeah.
my paramedics, my firefighters, they're able to do that. But ultimately, it's like we forget that whatever you do in life, whether it is a paramedic, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a therapist, we're human beings too, but you don't get to show
Yes.
that side. And I think
No, exactly.
I think
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about. Like you have to wait outside. But for me, it's like, how do you survive without using a little gallows humor and sometimes saying, for fuck's sakes, it just took a guy, cardio had to nitro him, make sure that he got to the hospital safely, and you've got a cut on your finger and you can't get a fucking Band-Aid. And, you know, if I sound cold, by the way, for everyone that heard me, I'm not a paramedic. It doesn't matter. I'm just a therapist. But that's one of those things that comes up, and I don't know what you think about all that, but
Oh, yeah.
it's
100%.
absolutely, like, it's hard to be ourselves in those situations.
Well, you do. You find you have to. There is a real separation between who you are every day as a normal person outside of the service and who you are when you've got that uniform on. I actually wrote a piece about that, about how the uniform almost became like a superhero's cape kind of thing, where people see that and they expect the superhero, not realizing that actually underneath is a person who is probably more depressed and mentally unwell than you will ever be, and you want this person to care for you. And there's a real stigma around that, you know, the care, who cares for the carer kind of thing. If the carer is not well, how are they supposed to look after their patients effectively? You know, there were times when I felt I wasn't mentally functioning as a paramedic, and I would go to calls and I would have to call for help. I would have to say, you need to send me another paramedic. I don't know what I'm doing. You know, patients who are really poorly, and I had no idea how to treat them. I was just standing there staring at them because I could not, it wasn't there for me to be able to actually help them. I was completely useless to them. And you don't, that's the last thing you need, you know. Say you're calling someone in an emergency situation, normally like a life or death situation. You want someone who's going to come in with the cape flying, who's going to save the day, you know. And so many of them couldn't do that, even though they had the uniform on. It was a struggle to do that sometimes. So yeah.
And I think it's also because, you know, we need to be human, and the human side is, I tell people, like when you get to your third or fourth call, you've been doing this for several years, it's like smelling the color Thursday. It makes no sense whatsoever. And that's actually very sensible because, yeah, your brain's a little mush because of all the hard stuff that you saw. It leads to depression, as you talked about. And I know that, you know, in pre-interview, we talked a little bit about suicide and colleagues and friends and all that. Can you speak a little more? Because that, you know, the ultimate sign of depression, right, is suicide attempts or suicide. I don't know what word we got to use, but suicide is the word I use.
Absolutely.
You want to speak about it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot I can say because I'm not an expert. I've had.
Oh, I'm not either. I'm just winging it.
I can only speak from my own experiences, and there was a point where, I mean, I've lost count of the number of colleagues I've lost to suicide over the years. I think I read somewhere that the rate of suicide in first responders it's like something like 24, close to 25%, like a quarter. It's ridiculous. It's compared to civilian numbers, it's really high. And there was a point where it seemed like it was happening every week. We were just hearing about someone, and this is not just paramedics. I'm talking about actually some dispatch staff and as well. You know, we ended up losing dispatchers to suicide, and those people that don't even get remembered by a lot of others, you know. So and I maintain that if I'd stayed, I might well have been one of them. I was reaching that kind of point. I think if I'd stayed, I might have been thinking about that myself. So it's really prevalent. It's terrifying to know how many people I worked with that are no longer here because of how they were feeling, and because they couldn't talk about it, or didn't know how to talk about it, or didn't have access, or whatever. So yeah.
Well, I think it's also because of the mentality, right? You have a thick skin, you know. And while we were talking, I quickly looked it up to a website I know. So it goes medical doctor, dentist, and police officers. They didn't mention the medical people, but to me, they also omitted the Department of Correction and people who work in the corrections.
Yeah.
Medical doctors and dentists, not surprising, they have access to good stuff. Police officers have access to perfect weapons. And I think that with the medical people too, in general, it's a hard thing to do. And, like if you separate ERs, emergency rooms, from the regular medical place, the ER staff also has a higher suicide rate than the regular. I think it's because we have no space and we don't give anyone that space. And, making that safe space is something I try to do in my therapy and my group sessions. But do you have any suggestions of how to make those places safe for people to talk about this?
For me, it very much became the only people. I mean, where I worked, you would tend to work with the same people over and over and over again. So you get to see when things aren't right with them. I mean, I had a crewmate. I knew him better than I knew my husband at one point. We worked together so often. He knew me so well that when I wasn't right, he could recognize that, and he would ask me, what's going on? Are you okay? He'd ask that question. And I think it fell to each of us to look out for our colleagues as opposed to expecting them to come and talk to us. It was when I first got, realized I was depressed. It was because actually it was a colleague who pointed it out to me, and I thought, oh no, that can't possibly be the case because I still make I still make jokes and I laugh, and how can I possibly be depressed if that's what's happening? But she pointed it out to me, and it was like, oh, okay, maybe I need to go and talk to somebody about this. But one of the things that I used to talk an awful lot about, and I don't think it has changed yet, but I maintain that I would like to see there be at least an annual mental health review with somebody, with a professional, like maintenance, basically. Just even if it's like you go for one session, they ask obviously the key questions they need to be asking to try and figure out what's going on, and at that point make a decision: do we need to be having more sessions, or are you great, you're good, off you go, back out into the world, I'll see you again next year, kind of thing. I think that's something would be really important in all frontline areas. I say you do health checkups on a regular basis, especially when you get to a certain age. Why aren't we doing mental health checkups? That kind of thing.
Well, what's funny is I have my first responders always kind of like surprised that I go to therapy and I have my own therapist. I'm like, yeah, because I'd be fucked up if I didn't.
Right.
I hear a lot of crazy stuff in my job, like, and you see it, but I hear it. And I'm not saying that one's more valuable than the other, but it certainly is not much different in that way. So I think that, I can only speak intelligently, and I'm sure it's happening in other places in Canada, the US, and even in Europe. But there's at least 2 departments in the Massachusetts area where basically they're giving you 4 hours to go see a mental health counselor.
Amazing.
Every year, and if you need more, because it's for transportation and everything else. And I know another place they're talking about a full day off, if you need it. And then for me, that's what I've always the goal of finding your way through therapy. My podcast is that I want mental health to be as important as physical health. I'd like to be able to. I have clients who come in only once every 6 months, 3 months, a year. Hey, Steve, I'm good. Oh, no, Steve, I might need help with that. To me, it's the same exact thing. It's like you don't need to like sit there and be psychoanalyzed on a couch, which some people believe it is. It really is about, hey, you doing good? No, you know what? I probably need a little review. I had like 4 bad calls last year. One, I'm still not over it. And yes, I work with a lot of first responders, so obviously I'm talking about that. And then we review them, and after 4 or 5 sessions, like, you know what, I'm good. I'm going to be on my merry way. See you in about a year. Sure, no problem. But we need to be able to do that. And, when you talk about depression, I think that, to me, it's post-traumatic stress disorder that you're talking about.
Yes.
And I know they want to change it so that first responders accept it a little more to post-traumatic stress illness or injury. I think it's injury. And whatever makes it workable, I don't give a shit. It's whatever works. But I feel like the other part too, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong, and sorry, I'm a feminist. Women have it harder than men in that way too, because you went into a male profession, so to speak, and you need to be tougher because you are a female. I don't know if that's been your experience or not, and I just wanted to throw that out.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really considered that, but yeah, it makes total sense, definitely. Just trying to think. Do you know though, I think most of the experiences that I saw of suicide were actually mostly in the male staff members. And I think that comes back to how men don't often talk about how they're feeling, and it's kept very quiet until eventually they just can't cope with it anymore. So um maybe I think actually maybe that's where my feminine experience is that women are very good at talking about these things, and actually that's why I say I think having therapy is so useful, because it comes from that woman's background of being able or wanting to talk more about these things. It's really interesting thoughts there. You just give me some little food for thought on that one, actually. Yeah.
And I like the angle you took. You're right. Males don't talk about it, and they tend to be the ones who commit suicide.
Mm,
Again, historically, I was a suicide prevention specialist for a while. The other reason why men tend to die of suicide more than women is that they tend to use a more violent way to kill themselves.
it's true. Yeah. Hmm.
But again, I'm not here to do suicide prevention just yet. But hey, always a great topic to talk about.
Mm,
But yeah, I really think that the ability to talk about it is half the battle. I
yes.
I've seen it too many times in my life and my career, not only about first responders, but in general. People will say something like, so sometimes I'm very sad when I watch a show with parents because it makes me think about my mom. Okay. Like, wow, it wasn't as hard as I thought. I kept it in my head all these years thinking I was some sort of like weak person. But ultimately saying it out loud helped. I'm just made it up because I don't want to identify any of my clients. But the
Mm,
point is that I try to tell men, like getting it out of your head, out in the open, just sometimes is so relieving, even if I don't do anything as a therapist, because I don't fix people, I just listen to people and I give them suggestions if they need to, but I'm not actually doing any fixing. And
mm.
I think that what I feel, and again, you can tell me what you think, but sometimes getting out that stupidity out of our head and saying it out loud. I mean, my therapist has heard most of my stupidities, and he still seems to like me for some reason, so it's great. But I think that that's part of what the therapeutic process is, and sometimes you can't do that at the station or the communication center and all that.
Yeah, well, there's that fear of, I think, of judgment, of like you say, you're supposed to be the person helping people. How can you be that person if you're saying things like, I'm really not feeling great today. I've been really thinking about this call and I might want to hurt myself, or, because there's I think it's fear of judgment, and there's just that shame, that there's a real shame attached to it, because you are supposed to be the person helping other people. You're not supposed to need help from other people. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. But actually, it was always really interesting when someone would say something like that, and other people would, all crewmates, your colleagues, everyone around you, most people would then go, yeah, me too, actually. I've been feeling that way. It's amazing how when one person speaks up, the rest think, oh, okay, I can say that. That's actually, it's safe to be able to say those things. And I think that was why it was always super important to ask your colleagues how they were, or talk, you don't seem yourself today, what's going on? Just because it could be anything. It could be a job that they've done, but it could be something going on at home as well. That would always have an impact on how you are feeling too. So just being able to give people the space to actually say something.
Right, and I think that you're absolutely right too. I try to leave I go to work, I take my home backpack, leave it at the door, pick up my work backpack,
Yeah.
and show up for that. But there's
Mm,
times where my home backpack was too full, so I had to put a little bit in my work backpack, and I do bring
yeah.
it to work. For
Mm,
XYZ, I have two teenage girls, and sometimes that can have its own challenges. And maybe I have a conflict with a friend or a conflict with a family member,
yeah.
or that there's XYZ to be done at the house and it's bothering me because it's got to be done sooner rather than later, and I'm trying. So it all shows up, and I think that the illusion that we can separate our home life from our work life and vice versa is absolutely bonkers. But I think that that's where having good colleagues and people you can turn to is so essential. Besides having a good mental health counselor, having a good
Yeah.
counselor in general. I say mental health counselor, whatever the hell works for people, right? But
Mm,
that's what I think too. We do bring stuff. We bring stuff from work to home and vice versa, and let's not pretend we don't.
yeah, absolutely. And I want to really add to that as well. Like,
No, you cannot add for it. I'm sorry, we're cutting you off. Go ahead.
just obviously the talking part is really important, but also giving ourselves the space to feel the feelings as well. There were times when I would do a horrible call and I would be off the next day, and actually the best thing for me was to spend the whole day wallowing in the feelings and actually experiencing, you know, the upset, the shame, the dread, everything that I went through from that call, but giving myself a cutoff point, like, okay, feel the feelings, but tomorrow you're gonna be better again, and that for me that was really useful as well. I feel like a lot of the time we would squish those feelings down and then still wouldn't allow ourselves to have those feelings even when we had the time to do that. So yeah, just kind of wanted to add that in there.
No, I appreciate it, and always feel free to interrupt. I talk for a living, so I'm easily lost in my own thoughts. But the other part too that you mentioned here, and I think that is very important to mention, is that I tell people, have your pity party. You want to have like if it's a bad call, take 8 hours of pity party. It's really, really bad, take a 24-hour pity party. I don't care about that. But after that shit, we got to get back into working on the other stuff or even processing that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what happens is that I think when you're depressed or you have anxiety or you're not permitted to have that, if you start wallowing, you stay stuck there and no one knows how, and you don't know how to get yourself out because you don't have that ability. And you're not asking for help because that's too shameful, right? Because you need help. Yep. Oh my God, you bastard. Why do you need help? So I think that plays all factors. So I appreciate you saying that because it is absolutely true. And I will quote one of my favorite Thich Nhat Hanh statement is, what you resist persists.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And the Buddhist in me will always want to share a little bit about my Buddhism. But what you resist persists. And that's just what it is. So you feel bad because you saw, like I've never, and again, I don't want to see it. I actually have no interest in seeing a bone sticking out of someone's leg. I have no interest. And if I did, I'd probably handle it, but I just don't want to see it. But if you saw that and it's still in your mind and you can still see it, that's tough. I saw someone have muscle collapse on their arm and you can see just the bones. And I still think about it. I still have a little bit of goosebumps, but I kept it to myself. And then I went to someone like, was that fucking strange or is it me? And the other person's like, oh my God, no one else said that. Thank God. And then we talked about it for 5 minutes and it was over. Now I still have goosebumps, but it doesn't bother me as much. Yeah. So I think that I tell people, like, talk about the weird stuff. And maybe someone will be like, no, you're weird. And that's okay. Then you can go talk to someone else who's a therapist or whatever. And if you're not weird, they'll be like, me too. And there's ways to join around these things.
Yes, absolutely. I think talking about it was the best thing I ever did. It was there was, 2-3 years ago, I would not have been able to share some of the stories that I share now without tears coming, without feeling like lots of anxiety, heart racing, all of that. And now I can just talk about it. It's a part of my history. It's a part of my past. It still, like you say, still gives you goosebumps and stuff, but it's much easier to talk about the more you share it. So,
well, as we get close to the hour here, I'd like to wrap it up. Knowing human behavior and human concentration is never more than 45 to 50 minutes. Anything you want to talk about that you do now and that maybe people can reach you and talk to you about it?
So I'm a writer these days. When I left the ambulance service, I became a writer. And actually, I do lots of different kinds of writing, but I have an account on Medium. I'll send you the link so you can share it. But
please,
I share stories about my paramedic life and what that entails, as well as other things. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff about being a paramedic on there. And I love to be able to, I've talked to paramedics from all over the world as well about their experiences. So if anyone ever wants to reach out and talk to me, I would love to speak to you.
And we can direct message you where?
You can, probably actually email me. Email me is probably the easiest way. hello@sarahwayte.com is the easiest way to get hold of me.
Right. So what I'll do is I'll link that in the show notes. But I appreciate you sharing your story. I've worked this field for a long time, and you being so transparent about what you just talked about is moving to me. And this is not just being nice to you; it's just the truth. And I like to thank you and thank you for sharing with my audience your experience, and I'm sure it's going to benefit some people.
Oh, I hope so. That's why I wanted to come on and talk to you, definitely. So thank you.
And I hope to talk to you again soon. Well, that completes episode 170. Again, Sarah Wayte, thank you so much to talk about there, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But episode 171 is going to be a little bit of my passion of working with first responders, how it started, where I'm at now, and all that fun stuff. So please join me then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.